Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor. Now, this is another kind of extra video that I wasn't expecting to do today, but then I remembered, oh, I have to do that video. And I wanted to get it out sooner rather than later because Steve Donoghue and Mathiew at Mayberry Bookclub are doing the world's easiest read-along. They're doing the read-along for Batman, A Dark Knight Returns. And Steve Donoghue and Mathiew have already come out with their Dark Knight Returns Part 1 videos. And they're both really, really good. I will link them both down below because you really should check those out. But of course, when I heard that they were doing that, I had to jump on board because I am and always have been a comic book guy. And it's been a long time since I've read The Dark Knight Returns. So it was a perfect time for me to take a look at it again. It's been probably about 10, 15 years, really, since I've read it. So I thought, yeah, that's a good time to do it. Now, in the past, and it's been a while, but in the past, whenever I decided to pick up A Dark Knight Returns, I've always grabbed this copy. This is my copy of the complete Frank Miller Batman that was published in 1989. This is a leather-bound edition of Batman Year One and the 4 issues of Batman: A Dark Knight Returns. Batman Year One was actually the better Batman story. But this is both of those in here because at the time, that was the complete Frank Miller Batman back in 1989. If only it was still the complete Frank Miller Batman. Frank Miller has gone back to Batman quite a few times, and it's always been a little bit worse every time. Unable to capture the magic, Frank Miller. So I've always gone back to this one. This one has the complete series. Look at that. Look at that. That's one of the iconic images from Batman: A Dark Knight Returns. So this has that. So this is always what I grab. But Steve and Mathiew wanted to do it so they would read one part at a time. It's a 4-part series. So I did something that I haven't done in decades. I went down to the vault and I grabbed the 4 issues, the 4 original issues that I bought when I was 15 years old as they came out of the Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. This is the first issue of Batman: A Dark Knight Returns. This is the first printing. This is the original one right here. This is the very copy that I picked up when I was 15 years old at the comic book store. It was actually literally called the comic shop. It was a tiny little one-room place in San Leandro, California, where I bought my comic books when I was a kid. And it was tiny, man, tiny. But this was on the stands, and I grabbed it right away. I didn't even know what it was. I just saw Batman, Frank Miller, Klaus Johnson. These guys had worked on Daredevil, and they had basically reinvented Daredevil as this awesome crime comic book. So I knew this was going to be good. I didn't know it was going to be as revolutionary and groundbreaking as it has turned out to be, because this is one of the most influential comic book stories that has ever been released. This changed everything with Batman. There were a few comic books that came out back at that time that really revolutionized comic books. And there were a few reasons for that. Now, Steve and Mathiew have already gone through in detail an analysis of the story of this. So I'm not going to go into the story too much itself other than say that this is a story about Batman who's been retired for 10 years. He retired when his young sidekick, Jason Todd, the second Robin, was killed. I think that's why he went into retirement. But he's come out of retirement now because there's some things going on in Gotham City. Two-Face has returned. There's this street gang called the Mutants that are causing a lot of trouble. And the Mutants, they're about as 1980s a street gang as you'll ever see. This thing is really a product of the 1980s, man. all the way through. So, yeah, they've already gone over the story in great detail, and they did a splendid analysis, the both of them, so you should check out their videos. I want to talk more personally about how I felt about it when it came out, and basically some of the effects that it had on comic books. I was really, really, really into comic books at the time when this showed up. And so I saw firsthand some of the effects on comic books that this produced, particularly on the character of Batman and some other DC characters. The thing is, at the time, now these guys had already worked on Daredevil, as I said, and they did revolutionary work on that comic. But we have to remember that Daredevil was a second-string Marvel character. Marvel was known at the time for kind of taking chances anyway. They took a lot more chances than DC Comics did up to this point. Then 1986 happened and everything changed. But Marvel tended to take chances. They were kind of known as the more mature comic book company. It's kind of funny to think that now when you go back and read some of those 1970s and early 80s comic books. But yeah, they were known as the more mature comic book company. And DC Comics were kind of grounded in the past, kind of old fogey comics, you know, even though we really liked those characters. But at the time, Batman, at the time this came out, if you read comic books, Batman was already cool. Denny O'Neil had gone back to Batman. Neil Adams had worked on Batman. Jim Aparo was working on Batman at the time. So Batman was the Dark Knight detective again. He in comic books. He was already cool. But he was recognizably the Batman that we are, or that we were familiar with. He was a do-good superhero. A good guy, through and through. He was the Dark Knight detective. He scared criminals, but he was the good guy. Recognizably so. And the same went for all of DC Comics superheroes at that time. But this came out, and Watchmen from Alan Moore came out at about the same time. Also that year, I believe, was when Crisis on Infinite Earths came out. They either came out right before or right after all this stuff happened, which completely destroyed and rebuilt the DC Comics universe and made it a much more confusing place. So a lot of stuff was going on at DC Comics at the time. And so this took one of the classic comic book characters and just completely reinvented that character, basically. To the general public at the time, Batman was the Batman from the Batman TV show. He was Adam West. There were no Batman movies when this came out. It was a different time, and nobody in the general public really took Batman seriously. But this comic book did, and this treated the character in a much more adult, serious manner, which we were not used to from DC Comics. And so it was revolutionary. And there were a lot of other things about this as well. The way it was told. This is a very structured comic book. Frank Miller was very careful how he told this story visually. And the interesting things that he did with this character, there's certain things about Batman that we understood when we were reading Batman comic books. So Batman as a character could not exist in the real world back in the day when we were reading him as he existed in the comic books. Because here's a guy who's dressed in a skin-tight costume, was fighting crime, swinging around from the rooftops, had a child sidekick, which he took with him into danger, dressed his child sidekick up ridiculously, and they had adventures together. This could not happen in the real world with a sane man, right? And we kind of understood that. But what Frank Miller did is he took a legend, because that's what Batman was, basically. He's a legendary character, and looked at him as if well, what if this was a real guy, you know? But he also kept all of that that legendary aspect of Batman, and that made Batman pretty scary. You'll notice that Batman in this comic book is really kind of cruel, unnecessarily so, when he's battling the criminals. This guy is kind of like the Dirty Harry version of Batman. Take no prisoners, you know, if he can hurt him, he's going to hurt him. Batman. It was interesting. It was a different Batman than we were used to seeing. And that super dark take on the character really took hold, kind of infected the character in a way, so that after this, people kind of expected and wanted Batman to be portrayed in that way. So it's interesting because Batman, it did change Batman's character. Because Batman, there's certain things about Batman that if you look at Batman as a character, he kind of makes sense. I mean, this is a guy who was traumatized as a young boy, seeing his parents shot to death in front of him. So how does this guy react when he's growing up? He dresses up as a bat and fights criminals. He's reacting as a child would. That is a very childlike reaction, dressing up in a costume and fighting the bad guys. That is a child's reaction to that situation. So you understood that Batman was kind of crazy, but it was never in your face, you know. In this book, it kind of is. And we kind of got to realize that through the course of reading this series and some of the Batman comic books that came afterwards. A lot of different writers kind of struggled with Batman to balance this version of the character with the character that they were familiar with writing and dealing with. Batman doesn't kill, for example. Why not, if he's like this guy? Batman doesn't kill in this comic book either, but you're kind of wondering the whole time why not, because it seems like he wants to, you know. It's interesting. Frank Miller is an extremist guy, unfortunately, and he had an extreme view of this character. As talented and just as immensely talented and as good a writer and artist as he is, his extremist viewpoint, I think, could be detrimental to this character. I noticed when I was reading it the first time, I loved this when it first came out, because I was 15. And the super tough Batman beating the hell out of criminals unmercifully was awesome to me, because I was a kid. But even as I continue to read this series, as the series goes on, Batman becomes more and more of an extreme character. And you can see that in the artwork as well. Get to the iconic shot. Now, when Batman shows up here, he's recognizably the Batman we knew at the time. There were a couple subtle differences. His ears were shorter. His belt was different, his utility belt. He had the old style utility belt, but he still had the bat signal on his chest. He still was wearing recognizably Batman's outfit from the late 70s and early 80s. As the series progresses, you'll notice that Batman's outfit changes. He reverts to just the bat, for example, and his look changes. It becomes much more giant looking. In style, he starts to look more like the Batman that was in the 40s. Frank Miller made a deliberate choice to go back to that look in his own way. And the art becomes very much more stylized as the series goes on. And Batman becomes more and more of an extreme character through the 3 other issues of Batman: A Dark Knight Returns. Even with this one, even as hardcore as Batman is in this issue, this is kind of a standalone story, and he's still recognizably Batman. He might be a hardcore, bitter Batman, but he's still recognizably Batman. But as he goes on, it becomes a much more extreme version of this character. And Superman shows up later on. And sadly, Frank Miller has no understanding of the character of Superman. Frank Miller doesn't get Superman at all. Has no idea why he is what he is or who he is or anything about the character. You just get the idea he has no clue. He's lost when Superman shows up. So his version of Superman is an unrecognizable character, which we'll get to when we get to it. Fortunately, Superman is absent from this. This first part is pretty good. This is an excellent, excellent comic book. It can be argued that this series gets better and better depending on how you look at it. For me, as I was reading it in the 80s, I started becoming more and more uncomfortable with the character that was being presented in this series. Batman is not the Punisher, right? Punisher comic books, the Punisher's the Punisher. That's what he should be. That's what he is. Batman is not that. And I felt that Frank Miller was pushing Batman in a direction that wasn't Batman, if you get what I'm saying. Batman at heart, despite all his crazy, and there's a lot of crazy with Batman, at heart, Batman should be a decent, good guy. And through the course of this series, he doesn't stay that way. He becomes sort of like a super fascist by the end of this series. It's sort of a super extreme right-wing fascist Batman that you get at the end of this by the end of this series. And even when I was reading this as a kid, I was uncomfortable with that. It basically lost me when Superman showed up, and Superman was doing things Superman would never, ever do. But I remember getting that feeling, as much as I liked it, as much cool stuff as were in this series. And when this first comic came out, I loved it. But as the series progressed, I remember how I felt about it and how my feelings were strongly mixed. At reading this as an adult, and I've only read the first part because I'm doing the thing and I'm only reading one part at a time. Excuse the gigantic garbage truck out there. They don't know I'm making a video. But reading even this part, yeah, I could, knowing where Batman's going in this series, it's interesting to read. This is a bitter old Batman who makes his return. It's also interesting reading this as a 50-year-old because I'm the same age as Batman is when he's returning. So that's kind of interesting. It's a very different experience reading this. But yeah, Batman completely changed from the single story. It completely changed Batman. It threw a lot of darkness into Batman. Between Watchmen and this, comic books became super dark for a long, long time. And a lot of that wasn't great. I don't think all of the results from this series and Watchmen were positive. There was a lot of negatives that showed up also. And it took a long, long time for some superheroes to come around to being superheroes again, recognizably so. So yeah, that's my first part of this, reminiscing about Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. And it's gone on awful long. Sorry, didn't mean to be so long-winded, but yeah. Batman: The Dark Knight Returns read-along part 1. I will do part 2, I think, next week. So I will see you then. Bye, guys.